I think the other bit as well is, if you're doing repeat hurdle jumps or you're doing, a set of pogo jumps or some bounding, there's also a point at which, if you hit a bad rep, it gets worse and worse and worse. I think varying within a set, both up and down, allows you to
Yeah.
come back down again and build it back up again. Otherwise, I think, you hit a bad position, and that tends not to get better if you keep trying to push the intensity through that set.
That was Eamonn Flanagan, and you're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast. Welcome to another episode of the podcast, and thanks for tuning in. This week's guest is Eamonn Flanagan. Eamonn is the lead strength and conditioning consultant at the Sport Ireland Institute. He holds a Ph.D. in Sports Biomechanics and is well recognized as an expert in the world of plyometrics and athletic performance. Eamonn has also spent over a decade in professional rugby. He's been a previous guest on this podcast at episode 250, and he's also just created and released a new course on plyometrics in conjunction with Sportsmith. On the show today, Eamonn will be talking about individualization and individual factors in plyometric training. He'll be talking about the surfaces the athletes play and grow up on as it relates to their plyometric needs. We'll be talking about plyometric intensities and the needs of team sport athletes. We'll get into testing and the Reactive Strength Index. This and much more on the show today. It was great having Eamonn back and looking forward to getting this going. Let's get to episode 446 here. Eamonn, great having you back on the show. I'm excited to ask you a bunch of questions here. And I'm glad we could finally make this work too. I know you've been a very busy man lately.
No problem. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. I enjoyed our last chat a couple of years ago, and apologies from my end for cancelling on you at very short notice last time. So I'm excited to make it up.
Yeah. I know we got a lot to talk about here. And, it's interesting, too. I think we've gone through, I don't remember exactly when our last podcast was, but I do think we've covered at least close to an Olympic cycle in the time since. Well, it was a shortened Olympic cycle, too. Maybe that's part of the reason.
Yeah.
But, it is interesting how, just the work that goes into that and how you've been keeping busy throughout. And I do want to get into some plyometric classification and some nuts and bolts, but I'd love to start with maybe a question that's a little more open and probably more openly practical to a wide variety of people, be it people who have access to data gathering and force plates, or just a more general sports performance situation. But in what athletic situations would you look to implement the more big classical plyometrics? I know I started my vertical jump journey really with, well, first it was with Air Alert, which was like high rep, like low intensity training, and then moved to depth jumps. And then that depth jumps turned into like 24-inch box, 30-inch box, and then bounding and those things. And those were an early bread and butter for me as a track athlete. And I think when people see those, when people see and think of plyometrics, that's the thing. But what about when you have a team sport cohort and it's injury prevention and you're filling in gaps and these things? So I'd love to start by talking about your plyometric thought process and integration in the relative to like those big hitters, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I get you. Yeah, and I think context is important. So straight away there, your particular context is that kind of track and field background that you have. And while I work in Olympic and Paralympic sport across multiple different sports, I definitely have not spent a big percentage of my time in track and field specifically. And probably most of my time in that area has actually been on the Paralympic side of things, where I think the craft is more around athlete management and individualization rather than necessarily working with a traditional track and field type athlete. So again, a lot of my context is coming from field sports like rugby, where I worked for a decade, and a wide variety of other Olympic sports, and not necessarily track and field, where you tend to have a much more long-term integration of plyometric activities over the lifespan of the athlete. And you also obviously, almost by definition, you tend to have the more explosive, talented athletes by the time you come to high-level sport. Mm. So I think when you're talking about those big classical plyometrics, if you're talking about drop jumps or depth jumps or, real high-intensity bounding exercises, I guess the first thing I would say is I would approach those primarily with great caution, and I would approach those with a very much a long-term kind of viewpoint. I tend to try and tend to try and think of plyometric training in kind of probably 4 phases in my head. There's your kind of almost your typical kind of extensive work. which in my mind can be very, very low level, very low impact, very low intensity. We can get into the specifics of that later. Then I kind of think about a more of a development phase where this can be developing into more voluminous kind of extensive work, or it can be beginning to introduce, touches of intensity. And then I think about what I would call more of in the third phase, you can almost branch in two different directions in my mind. What I call realization work, which is exactly those types of exercise you've talked about, very high intensity, explosive plyometrics like depth or drop jumps. Or maybe you branch into more transfer specific kind of exercises, which, for a sprinter, or for looking at having some positive impact on top speed running, for example, or stride length. That might be your classical bounding or hopping, high intensity bounding or hopping activities. So there's a pathway to follow. And I guess some of the things that guide me along the way are, where the athlete is at that moment, kind of what their training history has been, what their injury history looks like, what are they getting from their sports training on a daily or weekly basis, and then I guess it's what do we feel the intended outcomes of the plyometric training we're going to do. What do we actually want to achieve, and then how ready the athletes are for that particular type of training. So I probably worked with as many athletes, if not more athletes, who never progressed to some of those activities you're talking about. Mm-hmm. And then there's some athletes where you might progress to them quite quickly because they have a clean injury history, they have a very extensive, holistic athletic development over their kind of lifespan as an athlete. And maybe some of those classical high intensity plyometrics that you mentioned address a specific gap that they're not getting from their sport. And so I know a bunch of those points we might branch off into some of the questions that you had sent me ahead of time, but that's probably my overall viewpoint, I guess.
Yeah, for sure. It's an interesting thing in some sense in the realm of a sport performance coach. Is there's always that desire to whatever you're doing, you want to take it to a high level on some level. I think that's where a lot of times lifting, if you're prescribing the lifting, you like to see those taken to a high level. If you're prescribing plyometrics, you like to see those progress, but it's also a question of balance. And that's the thing where sometimes I feel like a lot of sports performance professionals would enjoy coaching track on the side, just so, hey, we can go as far as we can go with the bounding and the explosive plyometrics here. And it almost can draw a parallel or a contrast to, okay, well, how far do we need to go with this group of rugby players? What is their optimal, maximal they need? If you have like this layer of levels and depth jumps and explosive bounds are level 5 or 6, or like you're level 3 or 4, how many levels do they need to climb? And then at the lower, and maybe it becomes then, I imagine we'll get into this, but at the lower levels, how can you do that as well as possible? Like moving into the qualitative piece. Yeah. And maybe that's where you can get more out of it. If you're like seeking to maximize, which a lot of us coaches are maximizers, it's like, okay, what am I going to maximize and how am I going to do it? And that is, and framing success as that versus, well, how high up the chain can I take you? Because as a high jumper and triple jumper, I'm like, I used to make tennis players do like higher box drops and those things, and no one got hurt. Like I progressed it, I would say intelligently, but at the same time, it was a few years into that process. I was just like, we're doing this, but I don't think we need to be doing this. And so, anyways,
Yeah, no, well, I think there's a couple of things there that are interesting. I think as an athlete and as a coach, whichever side you're on, there's always a bit of a balancing act between around ego. What do I want to do versus what do I need to do? And as a coach, sometimes you can be guilty of trying to entertain yourself more than actually delivering what the athlete needs. But athletes can be very guilty of that as well. So I think that's definitely one thing. And then I think the other thing is, I think good systems or good approaches when you have. I think I have a fairly clear kind of framework that I use and that I work from, that I've shared. Others will have their own approaches. But I think when you have good frameworks or good regression models, the beauty, I think, is that you can have, 10 athletes all doing maybe, like you mentioned, 5 stages, maybe stage 1, stage 2, stage 3 of the same thing in the same space, depending on their needs.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's the beauty of it. I think some of the most enjoyable times I've spent in the general perspective in sports performance have been when I've had a group of athletes and it's not mass chaos, but there is distinctive buckets, and it also offers this coaching novelty in the sense of, okay, here's this athlete and this is their goal, and this is this athlete and this is their goal, and it's also enjoyable to have like that pinpoint nature, and people know that the work that they're doing is prescribed for them. But something you said, Eamonn, I have to chuckle internally just because, guilty of entertaining themselves, I'm like, yep, I've been there, done that many times, and probably will still do that many times in the course of my career moving forward, just because it is so enjoyable to try to take things and okay, what can we do here? What's the potential here? But then always coming back to the groundedness of what does the athlete need. And I want to ask you this, and maybe we covered this a little bit on the last time we chatted, but plyometrics in light of, or this is something I think about a lot, is the game is a plyometric, and I guess it depends on how do you define plyometrics.
Yeah,
I mean, it's like you can't move without a stretch shortening cycle for unless you're it's like, I guess, the most remedial like thing you could imagine. But so how do you look at? This is something I've thought about, and maybe I didn't have this specifically on the question list, but I'd like to ask it in light of the buckets and the way you progress. But so if I have athletes and they're getting, you could say, hundreds, if not thousands of ground contacts in a week by playing their sport, what's your process of saying, okay, here's where I'm going to take the volume they have and then inserting a plyometric, a hopping and extensive or upwards need into that mix of what they're already doing?
Yeah, very good question. What is my process? So I guess in theory, I would think, if you have an athlete who's receiving this amount of ground contact within their sport, then you'll feel the need to perhaps progress to the intensity exposures rather than the volume exposures a little bit sooner. But I guess that has to be predicated on whether or not the exposures they're getting has actually developed some kind of physical competency that you would expect to see. So Ireland, our environment is, very temperate climate. Mm-hmm. It's never too hot. It's never too cold, but it's very wet. So, a lot of our field sport athletes, whether they're rugby players, we have our own national sports, Gaelic football and hurling, which are, pretty elite level in our country's context. An athlete might be on field multiple times a week, but if it's on a soft, very, very compliant surface, I'm not sure how relevant that is to, let's say, what we might expect from adaptation from extensive plyometrics. So I guess the question is, if they may be having these exposures, you want to have that in your mind, but then I think there's also, well, does the competency they have match up with that? So, again, what does that look like in a coaching screening? It looks like things like, do they have good, ankle integrity in walking and marching drills? Do they have good, springiness or bounciness in, easy kind of skipping or pogo or in place hopping drills? So I think they can be doing this in the sport, but if you're not seeing the competency, then whatever they're doing over here in the sport hasn't had the intended effect. So I'd probably try and match up those two things. So again, in my context, you could have, let's say, a field sport athlete who is playing on those Irish, fields, which are wet and they're heavy in the winter. And on the other side, let's say in the last Olympic cycle, working with a taekwondo athlete who is, indoors on mats in bare feet. And so the difference in kind of foot, ankle, calf integrity between the two, the taekwondo athlete spending a lot of time in single leg stance, there's an athlete that I'm probably bypassing extensive work pretty quickly. Sure. On the other side, there's maybe an athlete who I'm going to spend a little bit more time in that area because those competencies you might expect to see aren't there.
Yeah. So it's basically like level one in a way. You mentioned extensive is like elastic threshold. And it's interesting. Yeah. I work with a few sand volleyball athletes, and it's interesting to see. Now, if you just play sand volleyball, different story. But if you're like going to be doing sand and going to regular, or you want to be good at other things on a solid ground, it's interesting to note the more dampening effect of the way that those athletes jump. It's feet very close together, a lot of knee bend. It's just a different elastic profile, and maybe that's the extreme. But I can definitely see what you're saying with the softer surface, the rainy surface. It makes me think a little bit about think Charlie Francis talked about it, like with running on grass for sprinting, like in the off season, because it makes the muscles like work harder and faster because the tendons aren't going to give you as much in that situation or something like that.
It's strength work, I guess, to some degree, yeah. And I think that's the big thing. I think with plyometrics, I try and think of is, probably think of it outside of the kind of lower level foundational work. Definitely think of it as it's strength training. The question is like, what strength quality are you trying to address with the training?
Yeah. If in a very general sense, so outside of the tech, and I'd be curious how the tech could loop into this, but I think about just physical education, and I always like thinking about John Garish's progressions at he works at a high school, but with like middle school age athletes as well, and just like it's just a lot of skips and gallops, and then like 5 like lower distance single leg hops, and then jump on the right leg and do 5, and just stuff like that. And I'm sure whatever the group of athletes you have in front of you, if you're just doing skips and hops and gallops and you just build an eye for it, that being a layer 1, really, I mean, I think that could be almost universal. And it sounds like even with higher level athletes, if you are in like your situation, you have a bunch of people who, either soft surfaces, or I think of athletes who never had a track and field exposure too. Like growing up, you never ran track. You never got on that bouncy, I want to say it'd be low compliance surf, or I was say bouncy surf. I was like, is it high compliance or low? Something's compliant or not, but a bouncy surface.
It's called stiffer, bouncier,
yeah, where it's like you get to, and that's why I love that you brought the surface up, just because I think a lot we think almost only in exercise terms, but it's like, well, did the body get a chance to be on this bouncy surface, and then even like a wooden basketball floor or the soccer or rugby pitch, these different things, and just allowing for these different adaptations to happen. Just because the body can problem solve so well. I imagine, it would be a different story. You get a 21-year-old athlete, and almost regardless of the plyometric history on some level, depending on what they did, if they just played on these different surfaces, you might get a different profile at that point. And it's interesting to consider.
I would say kind of anecdotally, I would probably see that, so for example, field, we have decent community or culture of field hockey in this country, and that is obviously a bespoke surface or turf, whatever you want to call it, much harder, much stiffer compared to, like I said, what the majority play: soccer, Gaelic football, rugby, which is almost always now still grass surfaces. And even just you take the people into your facility and you test, you can. I think you can almost see a fundamental difference that there. Those who have been on the stiffer surface for more of their athletic development period have more of that foundational, reactive strength or whatever you want to call it. I would say that's definitely typical. But yeah, you mentioned surface. Like to me, that's a key. Some of our conversation might be around the intensity of plyometrics, but within a single exercise, probably as in just within a single exercise, without changing the exercise itself, I think two of the biggest determinants of intensity are outside of the athlete themselves. It's intent. So whether you go at 60% or 100%, and it's what surface you're on. So you look on one example, that extreme example you gave, it's probably sand. Somewhere in the middle, it's maybe tumbling mats or gymnastics surfaces, and somewhere at the end, it's hardwood floors or something like that. So I think that's got to be one of the primary considerations. And sometimes, let's say you want that foot, calf, ankle, tissue tolerance or work capacity. Let's say that's your targeted adaptation. You want a little bit more proprioceptive development. You want time as a coach to look at more repetitions to see where the athlete's at or to coach them. Well, then that might be your more extensive, voluminous work done at submaximal intensities and maybe on a specific surface, like we mentioned.
Today's podcast is sponsored by Gym Studio. Gym Studio is a frictionless gym and studio management software. It can effortlessly manage memberships, schedule classes, track attendance, and even automate billing. To check out what Gym Studio can do for you, head to gymstudio.com and set up your free 14-day trial in less than 5 minutes. So when you're working with, let's say, Gaelic football, which I'm so fascinated by Irish sports, they seem extremely chaotic, and they look like they'd be so much fun to play. I know, talking like Kevin Mulcahy and like I'm so intrigued by all that. But so if you get these athletes who are used to like grass and a lot of times softer grass, and you're training them plyometrically, is this in a typical like a rubberized floor typically? A surface considerations for when you take those athletes and is it like a field turf, like a field hockey field? Like any thoughts on those surfaces?
So yeah, I mean, I haven't worked in Gaelic football in a very, very long time, and like most programs, especially at an amateur or sub elite level, most of the time you're constrained by your logistics and your environment. So it's not that in a lot of cases you don't get to choose what the surface is.
Sure. Oh yeah.
But I think a lot of the time what you would be doing is you'd be making exercise prescription adaptations based on what the surface is. So for me, I think, a lot of time we ask that question, or you've kind of asked it already, how do you figure out what they're getting from the sport and what value you could add that they're not getting from the sport, they're never going to get from the sport, but you may be able to add that into your program. And so if you think about, any kind of seasonal sport in this country, a lot of the time, a lot of early preparation work is done through the winter or in the first quarter of the year. So it's wet, it's damp, it's soft surfaces. But, if you're thinking about peaking, if you're thinking about winning championship games, that may be June, July, August, when you are hopefully going to be on harder surfaces and moving at faster speed. So as an example there, you'd be trying to find those opportunities to expose those athletes to harder surfaces for the purposes of having quicker contact times, faster ground reaction forces, more of a reactive strength component. And I do think there's an element of really low-hanging fruit there for a lot of field sport athletes. And I don't necessarily think you need to get to, going back to your first question, I don't necessarily think you need to get to the depth jumps or the drop jumps or the high repeat hurdle jumps or bounding to give athletes a fairly generous return on investment in that area of kind of reactive or plyometric ability.
Yeah. So with athletes initially, or moving up through like the tiers, the extensive, and then looking at what they're doing in sport, I'd be curious how, and I know we talked about this last time, just that qualitative piece, like just how does the plyometric sound? And if you're the coach, how does it look? And running athletes through basic extensives, skips and gallops and hops and things that are low intensity in nature. How does that interact with what you're seeing on the force plate in terms of like RSI and what you're testing? I know I had a question on reactive strength, and I know people will say different things about reactive strength, but tell me a little bit about, I have a group and I have one, what do they look like quantitatively or qualitatively? Sorry, I mix those two up sometimes. What do they look like and how do they sound doing these basic movements? And then what if I get them on the force plate and I see trends there? What are things you're looking at from considering both of those that would influence your decision on where to really steer them in a direction? Yeah,
I think to start with, if you think about, if let's say there's the Venn diagram of what do I want to see qualitatively and what is maybe the athlete's ability quantitatively, I'm not sure if there may not be a huge amount of overlap between those two things. Maybe it's 40-50% shared variance. So I guess if we're looking qualitatively, I think if you're working from the bottom up or the top down, you're looking at the head position and whether or not they're using the head to generate momentum. You're looking at maybe the relationship between the rib cage and the pelvis and how well they can stay stacked on ground contact, or how poorly they allow the pelvis and the rib cage to separate. You're looking at the foot position, around ground contact. So again, you have your coaching checklist on one side, and that's probably for me as probably one of the biggest determinants of where we progress to in the training program. On the other side, whether it's a drop jump or whether it's a repeated short contact time jump protocol of some kind, and you're looking at something like reactive strength index, so how long they spend in the air versus how quickly they get off the ground. That might be your quantitative assessment. For me, I think that is the initially, that's for me is more the determinant, or what it tells me is more what type of athlete do I have in front of them? Where are they on the spectrum of, elastic, to you almost described, the beach volleyball players as maybe being a bit more contractile dominant, let's say. So it probably is an indicator of that. And so again, like with most, like with many tests, oftentimes you can test better in terms of pure output or pure quantitative value, the uglier it gets,
Yes,
So
exactly.
there's
Yes.
always a trade-off, there's always a very difficult thing as a coach or as a sports scientist where how much do you constrain the test? I want the test to look perfect, but then it's not really truly
Yeah.
maximal because versus how open do you leave it and just let the athlete do their thing? And I'm probably on that side of it. I'm probably on the side of like, just do the test amongst these very basic constraints. And what I'm going to get out of that is I'm going to get a real impression of the strategy that you choose to solve this problem, the strategy that you use to complete this test. I'm going to get a really good indication of, like, compared to any other athletes I've worked with, where you rank, or, whether your contact time, super short contact time or a little longer on the floor and a little higher on your height. But I'm also not going to chase that number over time, maybe at the complete expense of the qualitative stuff we're seeing in the training that we're doing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting. You mentioned that testing, and well, it is too, like an RSI, it's also like a bilateral test. And I think been on my mind a lot recently. I've done podcasts, especially the ones I've done with Bill Hartman, is he talks about, and this is something you could frame to anything, but I think it's the most simple put in lifting, where you're either moving more reciprocally, where joints are kind of gliding or spinning relative to one another, which would be like a heels elevated goblet squat that you're breathing through, and it's there's not a lot of extra tension. You're not forcing it. You're just using core motions. Versus, hey, let's put a heavy back squat and it's a max, and now you have to have a forced exhalation or an exhalation against a closed glottis on the way up. You're going to guarantee you're going to, instead of like muscles neatly or joints neatly gliding against each other, you're going to have a lot that have to stick. They have to lock to lift that weight. And with that comes too, like excess muscle tension, face tension, neck tension. And, you mentioned it well, Eamonn, like I had a just jump mat. Like I remember I bought one, and it was partly at the time this was like 20 years ago, and I thought I was going to use it for my master's thesis, and that didn't, that didn't happen. And so I just had it, but I was obsessed with the 4-jump test on that thing. And there's something about like living for those tests that you do. If you're a strained person, there is an extra strain that comes out. And I even think too, if it's a bilateral situation, there's extra chance for the body to kind of squeeze into itself, if that makes sense, versus like a fluid, relaxed bound. Like you said, on some level, they are two different skills. There is overlap 100%, like just the core, power, muscle power outputs and levers and things like that. But it's the good athlete, the good mover is always going to be they're probably going to be better at the skills you see versus like the grinder gets fired up for the test and all that. And I'm sure it's not always like that, but I've seen how that transformed my own athleticism between college track and then just testing all the time, and a lot of bilateral, how high can I get these hurdles on the hurdle hops, and you lose that smoothness. So it's interesting to think about that, because I'd imagine you get that like smooth, graceful athlete on the field, and maybe they don't test super well, but they're probably pretty fluid in a lot of things they do too. So yeah, having that understanding is, I think, really helpful.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's probably where with some of the testing and assessment, where I've maybe changed my thinking a little bit, is moving slightly away from this idea that like more is always better with something like a reactive strength measure of some kind. Because I think you will get to a point with athletes who are well developed, who are broadly progressing well and positively within their sport, and have their reactive strength at a relatively high level that you can be pretty sure it's not stopping them from performing. I think there's always going to be diminishing returns there at some point. And having said that, though, again, with some of the athlete groups that we've talked about already, I think there's also clear cases where you just look at a particular test, or you look at, like I said, maybe the foot and the ankle function at ground contact in running or in marching and skipping drills. And you just know that we just need to drive some adaptation here in the lower limb. With some of those sports that we've talked about, again, coming back to that question of, what has the athlete done previously? What's their training history looked like? What are they getting on the field? A lot of the time, what they've done previously or what they're getting on the field is much more in that kind of, in terms of previous training, like, it's maximal dynamic strength or maximal isometric strength. It tends to be a relatively well-developed quality it's maybe a little bit more, there has been some explosive strength work. But I think my experience is that react outside again of the kind of track and field domain that is your reference point. Very often, like plyometric ability or that basic quality or reactive strength, it's very neglected. I think sometimes it's not something that is often included, and as a result, I think there's always I think there's often some easy wins there.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, that's not to say. I'm glad you mentioned that, because it's certainly not to say, hey, it's too much of a track thing, or you could grind it out to, so don't do it. And I like, one of the things I like, I think it was something Carl Valley had said a while ago, is trying to make the training the test as often as you can. So, because it is like, as soon as something's a test, it is more of a little bit more of a strained thing. But if it's like in the context of training, and it's more, but it is something you measure, that you're able to do both, and it's smooth quality movement, I think that's where there's also that win there. And you're not thinking about being tested either. But I would agree with that definite. And so actually that leads me to ask you about that. So what are you looking for in terms of like needs? Saying you have a group of players, you're seeing something qualitatively, or like you mentioned, you do the test. Okay, their reactive strength is really poor. What tends to be the buckets those land in terms of, are they doing more extensives? How intense are you getting in that intensive work? Like how, like you said, you're not getting up to you're not having them drop off a 4 foot or a 1 meter box. But what is their trajectory if they're falling short on some of those qualities?
I would definitely start with some. I think, especially if we're talking about, let's say, a more of an unknown group that you've not been working with for a period of time, I would definitely start with something that's less intense and more voluminous. And there's a couple of reasons for that. I think one, as a coach, it gives you more repetitions to coach. So I think that's a good place to start sometimes. It gives you more repetitions to see, to actually observe what's happening, especially if you've got more than one or two athletes in front of you. And I think it also helps the group, the athletes and yourself, to establish what is their kind of tolerable volumes, what is their kind of, how much work can they kind of tolerate, So I think it'd be starting there. But then I think the beauty of, like you kind of mentioned, series or progressions where you have, in place, hops into skips and into bounds. I think then it's quite easy to have, pretty simple progression. So maybe on one end there's pogo jumping, which I think is a really useful tool to have. You can work on pelvic control quite easily in it. You can help athletes understand that feeling of kind of being stacked on ground contact. You can coach the foot placement pretty well. And that might be your starting point. That could be 20, 30, 40 reps in more extensive work, or it could be little exposures to every second or third rep, adding some intensity and adding some speed off the ground. It's very adaptable even within the one set. And again, in your group, a progression from that might be, low hurdle jumping, repeat hurdle jumping over low hurdles, where there begins to be a little bit of, more forceful leg extension, on ground contact. And then maybe at the end of that progression, maybe you have high hurdle repeat jumping off short ground contact times, or maybe it is drop jumping. And so again, you kind of have a spectrum. They're all effectively the same thing. They're all basically trying to generate force, fairly kind of knee and ankle dominant, into the ground in short contact times, mostly a vertical application of that force, and they're all bilateral. You know what I mean? So they're all kind of the same thing. But you just drive up through those gears depending on the athlete in front of you, I think, and how well they're tolerating the volume, how well they're executing the exercise, and that little bit about that little bit you might know about their own individual history. And then, in a unilateral sense, the same thing might be, your starting point might be, let's say, unilateral, single leg, submaximal hops in place, or multi-directional hops. Then it might be, maybe more of your skipping type actions, which again, a bit like the pogos, you can dial them down or you can dial them up even within the same set. And again, you're dampening the intensity a little bit because you have that kind of double, almost boom, that double foot contact approach. And then, the other the other side of that is, maybe more your classical bounding. So again, to me, they're all kind of the same thing. They're unilateral. Obviously you probably go from in place to more horizontal force application, but they're all broadly the same thing. And you can just dial athletes up through the gears on those exercises based on some of those factors.
Yeah, one thing you mentioned, I have my next question is on extensives in light of team sport athletes who are getting a lot of contacts. I think you already partly answered that, at least with the need-based. But you mentioned changing within the same set. Like I've been thinking a lot about Rob Assis, track coach from Illinois. He mentioned the idea of crescendo plyometrics. So like you're doing a set of bounds or skips, and we've done, if in the track community and most of sports training is familiar with the sprint buildup. Like you start slow and then you get faster. And it's funny because I think I took those for granted back in the day when you always did those. But it's like there's so much beauty in a sprint buildup because you go from slow to fast and you experience all the little shades of increased velocity. It gives you more awareness. It gives you a sense of rhythm. And it's just like, why don't we do these with plyometrics? Why not do it with a bound or a skip or a gallop or anything? And then with the plyos too, you can do it for distance or height or whatever. But even, like a hop in place. Like I think you had mentioned like every third hop maybe is high or like.
And I think so. I guess there's two different things there. There's like you said, the crescendo, the build up, and can understand that. I think for me, there's also in terms of every second or third or fourth effort. To me, that's also it helps you do a couple of things. Comes back to your point around, expressing force near maximally but very relaxed.
Yes, yeah.
Versus expressing force maximally but maybe not very relaxed.
Yeah.
So I think when you have the freedom to drop down the intensity, dial it up again, I think you get to play around with those different combinations of tension and force production, which I think is nice. I think the other bit as well is, if you're doing repeat hurdle jumps or you're doing, a set of pogo jumps or some bounding, there's also a point at which, if you hit a bad rep, you just end up like it gets worse and worse and worse. I think, again, varying within a set, both up and down, allows you to come back down again and build it back up again. Otherwise, I think, you hit a bad position and that tends not to get better if you keep trying to push the intensity through that set. I think it just gives athletes the opportunity and the freedom to play around with things and also to take certain reps on their own terms. So we might come over a hurdle, we might get into some sub-maximal bouncing pogos before the next hurdle. And it doesn't matter if it's 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, the athlete takes the next more intense effort when they're ready and they feel they're in a position to do so most effectively. Yeah. Obviously with learning and with time, the hope is that they don't need to do that, but yeah.
Yeah, that's athletics too. I had a couple of podcasts with Vern Gambetta in the past year, and he talks a lot about rhythm and tempo. And I think early on when we get into coaching, it's like, well, why is that important? Should we just get stronger and max out all our abilities? And yeah, in a sense, yes, we should get stronger. Tissue should have more output. You need maximal efforts to do that. Absolutely. But then if that's just becomes the thing and you don't explore the little shades in between, but it's like you said, those little hops, like if you're doing like 3 little pogos and then 1 tuck jump, 3 little pogos, 1 tuck jump, it like each one kind of resets the body. It's kind of like a fractal, like, it's something that also represents a greater training concept. I remember this was like a big moment for me. I remember after years of just trying to do the highest hurdle or the highest depth jump, and if I'm going to do a set of 4 sets of 5 depth jumps or something, they're all off the high box. They're all trying to go and touch something high. I don't remember what I read or who I interacted with that got me on this train, but like the idea was, no, I'm going to start with the low box and really quick contacts and just relax, quick, snappy, poppy. And that's most of the sets. And then we'll go to the high box. And it's so much better after that. And I've extrapolated that to a lot of other skills and abilities. It's just because, and then I think that maybe prime me for, hey, maybe most of the work or a lot of the work should be like, we talk about oscillatory reps in the weight room, stuff where you're just twitching back and forth and muscles have to turn on and off and you have to cycle between internal and external rotation really fast and all those things. And that's like this core. And then occasionally you explode. It's like sport too. It's like you're playing a sport. You're jockeying, you're scanning, and you explode. You're jockeying, you're scanning back, and you explode. And it's like, hey, this is all wrapped up in one exercise. This is pretty cool, and it just feels good. So I've seen. It seems like I've seen a lot more of that type of movement. But I also saw that back even in the old Russian training videos. I think the Russian lunge jump, the original was like 3 little pulses of a lunge and you explode up. So clearly someone figured that out a long time ago too. But
I guess one of the there's a few kind of thoughts that come to mind there. I do think like I'm probably not as far along that spectrum as you might be. I still think there's a couple of things that would be in my head. One would be, for example, that idea of sport is like that. You got to you're waiting, and then you attack. But I guess the big difference compared to what I've described there is one is not on your own terms and one is on your own terms.
Yeah.
That's a big thing. And I guess the other thing I have in my head as well is, again, when we come back to that thought of like, okay, we will do some of these certain exercises and they really are force maximizers, whether that's maximal strength work or high threshold plyometrics in shorter contraction times. They're really force maximizers. And yeah, we accept that there may be an over stiffening that might occur in that. But I suppose and you might have more insight into this than I, but I think like from almost a motor control point of view, I am a little skeptical as to how much, what might be less than 50 reps of an exercise in a week can have on, the running gait of an athlete who's sprinting X number of strides a week. Yeah. Wouldn't be too convinced that what we do here, even if it is a little bit on the too tense, too stiff side of the spectrum, I wouldn't be too convinced how negative that could be on the activities that they've been doing since they were kids and that they're doing on a higher frequency. And ultimately that work that we're doing, again, whether it's those higher threshold plyometrics, whether it's our maximal strength training, again, we're not doing them for their sake. We're doing them to try and drive specific adaptations, which might help over here on the other side. Yeah,
I agree with that. In context of and I think a lot of that, my thoughts come from the track and field window too, because if plyometrics is, instead of in team sport, maybe the extra plyos you're doing is, 3% of every single thing you're doing in the week. 2%, probably less, versus if I'm a track jumper, it's a much higher percentage. And if it's a much higher percentage, well, let's go into that percentage and let's really trick it out so the cycles and the relaxation and the movement mirror what we want in the event. But I even think too of even doing things like a maximal iso push run specific, like Alex Natera's type stuff. I guess at its heart, that's a very orienting, like stiffening thing. Like you wouldn't want to be that stiff when you actually run, but that's why it's an isometric. It conditions the tissues. It creates a more of an overcoming property of the tendon to, when you do run, be stiffer. So it's just like, it's something it gives you to be better. And I can imagine, plyometrics, there's probably a limit to how fancy you really need to get with those things, even if it was, as long as the tissues are adapting ultimately, and then if you're doing like the warm-up skips and hops and gallops, that seems like it would be the ideal place for that. But I do like the, I do like the...
I think as well, there's always that little bit of a trade-off. You've touched on it there with the ISO push type example, but there's always going to be that trade-off between kind of specificity and I would say overload. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly.
So I think a lot of the time, like those exercises that allow us to significantly overload a physical quality, they tend to be further removed from the sporting action we might be trying to have a positive effect on. And that I think is where you have like the most, let's say, freedom to allow just the raw force expression. So that's your heavy squats. It might be your depth jumps. It might be, because they're quite far removed, whether it's high speed running or some other action on the field or in the sport, it's quite far removed in terms of motor patterning. And I think you can afford to have, that bigger distance between, just your pure overload. I think where it can get maybe trickier is, and maybe people can be guilty of, is where you try and get a little too clever with some of your plyometrics and you try and make them, real highly specific. But then it comes down to, are you just doing maybe like a bastardized version of the sporting action itself? Would you be better just doing the sporting action itself with good coaching and good recovery times, and or which I think is often the case, are you actually overloading a physical quality?
Yeah.
And if you're not, just do the sporting thing and do your general stuff over here.
Yeah. It makes me think about, I've been going back to some of Gilly's committee, French. Vern Gambetta corrected me on I said committee, so to all the French people, I'm sorry, I was butchering that for a long time. But looking at his stuff coming out of the 80s and the 90s, and with all the AI translation, you can get these things and just scan your phone or highlight the text and it'll translate it for you. And I look at what he was doing back then, and it's just so funny how things go in cycles, because you're right. Now you do get a lot more, hey, well, this plyometric or this movement is going to be really specific to this sport action. And sometimes it's really good, but sometimes it's just kind of hokey, and it's not actually that specific. But back then it was like, okay, here's all the neuromuscular qualities and ways to overload the tissue. And then you could loop it in. You could do a set of heavy half squats or heavy max calf raises, and then a set of hurdle jumps or depth jumps, and then a set of jump squats, and then go do a volleyball spike. And now there you go. And now you can see and feel how those things can feed right into the movement that you're doing. And it is I think about this in the sense that would be if you're going to go as far as you can with sports performance, that I don't see any way you could go further than that without actually being the sport coach anymore. It's like, it's almost
absolutely,
like,
yeah. And I think that kind of contrast training approach, I think a lot of people latch onto it from the potentiation point of view, this idea that perhaps what you do within the set, within the contrasting set, that you'll get a potentiation effect, whether it's on that fourth exercise, that volleyball spike or whatever. I think, some of the evidence for that can be still pretty ambiguous, but as in whether there is a true potentiation or performance enhancement effect within sets, I think that can be a little bit ambiguous. But I think if the performance of that sport-specific action isn't getting worse, and if you're getting exposed to, the way you've described it there, maybe 2 or 3 different strength qualities, and certainly 1 or 2 of them are probably going to be intense enough to drive some positive adaptation, maybe it's those 90% half squats or, the maximal effort, lightly loaded jumps, whatever it is. And if the sporting action at the end of that contrast set is not getting worse, at the very least, like you're developing a couple of qualities probably pretty effectively, and you're getting the opportunity, like we discussed already, to kind of toggle between the real force expression and the more relaxed, faster force expression. So you're getting that kind of, I don't know if that's a true motor learning effect or not, but you're getting the opportunity to explore that. And also, it's just a really enjoyable, kind of fun way to train.
It is.
And I think the other thing I like about that as well, especially in Olympic sport, people have this idea that, it's a 4-year plan and you can do a 4-year progression to peak for a games. Well, in Ireland, you can't do that. You have to qualify for games. And before you qualify for games, you got to get your ranking up and you got to get invited to the right competition. So it's never a 4-year plan. It's like a 3-month plan or a 1-week plan or a 1-day plan that changes because you get an invite to this competition that has the potential to build your ranking, get you into a better draw, get you seeded, whatever. I think one of the other big values, one of the really things I love about that kind of French contrast approach is that I think it's effective, but it keeps you viable to change your training in a number of different ways. If all of a sudden you realize, my season's over, it's all about next year, well, you can dial back into maximal dynamic strength development very, very quickly because you've been touching 80, 90% for a couple of reps in those sessions. If, your season's extended and now all of a sudden you have a peaking event in 6 to 8 weeks, well, you've been doing a lot of that, fast dynamic work or reactive strength work within those components as well. So for me, that's just a really, I was going to say flexible, adaptable way to train because, if you're working on these 3 or 4 kind of qualities, you can double down on any of them at any given time if you need to readjust and reassess your training goals.
Yeah, it's a very adaptable. It's not something that every time you bring in so many athletic qualities, it really gets to the heart of what you're doing. And I think they're one of the most simple, probably effective and underrated ways to train is squat, and you have a low basketball hoop in the gym and just squat and do some dunks, and it's just so good. Okay, so extensive. I do want to ask you this. So I've had a few conversations with different people, different thoughts on this, but the role of extensive plyos, both off and in season, when athletes are already doing all these ground contacts, and maybe it changes based on surface, but what's your take on, and or based in need there for athletes who might need more of it, but just what's your take with how much volume to do with some of these things, especially extensives, if an athlete's already running a lot, and maybe you answer taekwondo, single leg a lot, and those types of things. But general principles with how much do we do off season and in season with athletes from the extensive realm of things in terms of their athletic need, and if we're not are we overloading? Do we need to do this?
Yeah. Well, I think, you've kind of hinted at it there. I guess, my general premise would be that this is work that we do at a time when maybe some of the other on feet loading is a little bit diminished, like early preseason or, break weeks or whatever. And I would probably work from the idea that, especially in sports where, there is a lot of moderate intensity ground contact in the sport itself and in the sport training, when that ramps up, I'm certainly going to be less likely to do extensive work. I'll probably put it out on my Twitter account quite a bit. I have a kind of a framework of plyometric volume, and for me, like in the kind of extensive phase, it could be anything from 100 to 300 ground contacts. And that is a huge range. But again, it depends what you're trying to achieve. If what you're trying to achieve is somebody just learning about how to be a little bit more springy and plyometric in contact with the ground, and you want opportunities for them to work on their foot placement or their pelvic control, and they have a real remedial need, well, then you're going to need lots of repetitions at lower intensities to do that. If it's more about, just actually building them towards being able to tolerate higher intensity training sessions, well, then maybe it's a slightly higher intensity of extensive work for 80 to 120 foot contact. So they're kind of the broad kind of bandwidths I'd work from. But I think what I'd always have in mind is, like, what are we trying to achieve with this type of work, and where do we want them or hope that they will go next?
Yeah, it's not necessarily, I suppose, the easiest question to answer. Just from
I guess maybe the question to some degree can be with extensive work is, why are you doing it?
Yeah.
And, I think that's probably where we don't often have a lot of clarity. People maybe do it because they think you're supposed to do it. Mm-hmm. It's probably something in the past I didn't do a lot of, because I always thought of plyometrics as purely this high output event. You know what I mean? And so why would I do 20 reps of an exercise? Like, obviously within 20 reps, the ground contact time is going to get longer and this and that. So I guess the question is, why do you do it, or why do I do it? For me, I'm not entirely convinced that extensive work, massively stiffens the tendon or massively changes the properties of the calf musculature necessarily. I'm not convinced of that. But I do think it's an opportunity for me. It's an opportunity to refine technique. It's an opportunity to figure out for the athlete or the group that's in front of you, like, what is actually tolerable for them. Like, if they can't tolerate 60 to 80 contacts of really low intensity work, well, then we're not going where I thought I was going next. We're not going there anymore. So, it's an opportunity to coach. It's an opportunity to establish kind of their tolerable volumes. And it's an opportunity, again, like we've talked about within some of the exercises, to begin to expose, introduce that little bit of intensification, rep by rep or within sets. And I think it's a very safe environment in which to do all those things. And there's also an element where it just kind of works as something to do before you get in the gym anyway, before you go on the field anyway, or before you do your speed exposure anyway.
Yeah, that is true.
And sorry, last thing, and also, I guess it's also very complementary to the other type of work that you might be doing at that time of year. It's very easy to do that type of work and get into some heavy lifting, or to do that type of work and get into, more general conditioning, for example. It's very complementary to the type of stuff you would be doing in preseason phases, and then probably less so when you get into that in-season work.
Yeah, I agree. That's a great point, because universally, just like bouncing or really shaking. Like I this was a year and a half ago. It was at maybe more now. August of 2023, I went to one of Evolve Move Plays workshops. And it was led by Aaron Cantor, and he. I think I've seen this come up from Frank Ferencich. It's a little bit in the martial arts world, maybe in the Tai Chi world, but it's just the warm up. The first thing you're going to do is just shake for 5 minutes. So not necessarily bounce, but just you're shaking your body up and down. And I've seen Ido Portal, maybe I'll link it to this show. He has like a 25-minute video on how to shake the body. But so we did shaking stuff. We did arm swings, like just letting the arms loose. Like there reminds me of like fast and loose, Dan, John, and Pavel stuff, or just letting the arms shake loose and letting the tension out. And then there was like a self percussion and then rolling. And my body felt unbelievably activated after that in so many ways. But even just the shaking there's just something about bouncing. People say it's like the lymphatic system. There's like tensioning, detensioning. It's relatively low intensity. I think there's a lot more there. Like you said, it goes beyond just the tissue. So I could imagine, hey, if you want to warm up a group and we're just going to do 3 or 4 minutes of just kind of novel, fun shaking or hopping, regardless of the feet and tendons, there's something that's to that. And I also think about actually since that conference, a lot of my online clients, I'll have for certain warm up days, it'll be either like 5 minutes of calf jumps or 5 minutes of shaking, you pick. And a lot of times it's the shaking, just for that reason. It's just like a rhythmic thing. So I'm glad you brought that point up, because I think if I was just looking at tendons and volumes, it would be easy to say, well, they're always just getting that, so let's not do anything like that. And there is some viability just with thinking of it that way too. So I was, it is interesting as well. I was just thinking, I think a lot of my own bias and anchor comes from like that kind of thing, like me playing basketball in high school on a wood floor, relatively hard. And I grew up, I was you could call me crazy because I was doing single leg jump roping when I was 14 just to try to jump higher. So of course, by the time I play basketball, I do track, I'm crazy as a kid, so I do single leg jump roping. Of course, by the time I get to play basketball in high school, I wouldn't need that. I wouldn't need extensives. Like it would be probably one of the last things I would physically need. But
and I think that's also, I think in the modern, not to be old man shakes fist at clown here, but in the modern world, there probably is, and it's a little bit of a cliche at this stage, but there probably is less and less and less and less of that.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like as you're a parent, you got kids who are of ambulant age, you actually have to make an effort, a concerted effort to get them out there and get them, and they'll do it, but it's effortful, and it's very easy for athletes to obviously specialize early and arrive at a very, very high level of ability within their chosen discipline without a lot of these fundamental skills. And I know most of the people listening to this already know that, but it's not a problem that's getting better. If anything, it's more of a challenge with each passing year.
Yeah. Zach Evanesh had on this podcast had said in one of his youth class, I think it was middle school or something, some kid fractured his foot while jump roping as part of the warm up. And some new kid probably just totally deconditioned. It's like, man, if you're there, but it is, with the jump rope and I know you have children as well. And it was, I was going through the Athletic Development Games library of movements. And one of the tools they had was just a big, 2-person or 3-person double Dutch jump rope. Is like brightly colored. And I was like, I got to get that for my kids, and we go outside, we all spin it together. And it's amazing. You spend time coaching older athletes and then watch kids just doing a 3-person jump rope, and there's the plyometric value of that, the rhythm, not just the ankles, but the whole body is really good. Even for, obviously my daughter likes it, but even my son who's 6, I'm watching him do, I'm like, wow, if he gets good at this, he's going to, not trying to be the overbearing parent, you guys do it if you want to, but you can just see those abilities already. And if you have it and you take that into all the sports you do from this point forward, it's just going to go exponential. And so, but if you didn't do any of that and you only played on grass and soft grass, and you're probably going to be in a rough spot with all this stuff.
Now the question, I guess, the natural question, the skeptical question from there is if you haven't done that at those kind of key milestones of, prepubescent and postpubescent development, how much, 120 bounces at 60%, for your weight section, I don't know if that's going to move the dial on anything.
Yeah.
If you've already missed that window. So again, not 100% sure how much of a difference we can make by the time it comes to that really negative situation. But again, it's almost like, people talk about earning the right. Well, if you can't do that, if you can't get your 60 to 80 to 100 contacts done at 50 to 60% intensity in a relaxed motion with the feet in the right position, if you can't get that done, well, then we need to forget about progressing to hurdle jumps and bounding. And maybe we just need to, get you a little leaner. Maybe we need to do some more remedial isometrics. Maybe we need to stay in this phase for longer and do more marching. and walking based work. That's probably how I would kind of view that extensive phase. You asked some questions at the beginning of this of, how do you decide what people need?
Mm-hmm.
How do you decide where they're at? A lot of it, I think you're deciding in that phase, because I think it's a low risk phase, where you have opportunity to observe, an opportunity to coach, because there's a lot of repetitions. You can, and so I think the phase is almost, the training phase is almost the screening tool to a degree.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I think, and it just gives you that, whether it's 4 weeks or 8 weeks, it gives you that period, or whether it's 8 sessions or 12 sessions, it gives you that period to really formulate a plan for that particular athlete, or like you said, those buckets of athletes within your group of, these guys are just going to end up doing marching and walking drills and some of those ankle specific isometrics, and these guys are going to stay where they're at, and we're going to build the volume a little bit and touch the intensity, and these ones are going to intensify a little bit more aggressively.
Yeah, so much of that just coming, like you said. I do think you can make changes after like age 18, because I think that research says that's where the tendon, like the potential of the tendon is kind of set. Like whatever you did before age 18, that's like the code. It's like the tendon code. I mean, you can make changes after, but I think it's a lot harder. The older you get, it just is harder and harder and harder. And the question is how much. If you have someone whose tendons in their feet and that system was never really trained, versus someone who just grew up doing that stuff. And having kids, you see it. You see how they move and they skip. And if you watch them jump rope or doing stuff, or they're just jumping off of high stuff all the time, it's it definitely adds perspective to that, and then how that will unfold over time. So I do want to ask you, with the time we have left, I want to get to this. It was the last question, but I'm excited to ask you, just with everything you've gone through, is what has changed, or how have your views on plyometrics evolved in the last decade? Is there anything now that you do now that you like, or did 10 years ago, you're like, I don't do that now, or just how have things changed in that time period?
There's definitely a couple of things that come to mind, and maybe we've kind of half touched on these. I think in the past, when I was very much like a strength and conditioning coach, working principally within professional rugby, certainly in the early part of that journey, I was too fixated on plyometrics as purely a high intensity intensification realization type exercise, and I was probably too bound by the intensity and rep ranges of strength training into plyometric training, if that makes sense. And I wasn't maybe as cognizant as to how we could touch on these abilities at different levels and in different phases over a full training year. So again, it was okay, we're in a peaking phase. Now we need to, contrast our heavy squats with our repeat hurdle jumps, and we're going to max, high force over here, high force in short periods over here. And I didn't have enough progression to that point. So again, some of the learning from that is using extensive work a little bit more, using, I would say, longer series of even high intensity work a little bit more, and not being so bound by rules that were probably established in strength training as opposed to plyometric training. That's definitely one thing that comes to mind. I think the other piece is, is probably again, tied into that, it's that old strength coach, maybe fable of, are you strong enough to do plyometrics? Do you need to have that double body weight back squat, to achieve, to safely perform plyometric training? I was probably in that camp at some point, and over time you realize, well, actually, if I'm doing these exercises in a manner in which, they're quite ankle dominant or quite calf, Achilles dominant, well, what does it actually matter what I can do on a hip knee dominant back squat? If I'm going to look at anything, maybe it's like you said in your contrast training example, if I'm going to look at anything, maybe it should be that maximal calf strength type activity. So I'm probably too hung up on that. Now, I think some of that probably comes from, the realization that it comes from a good place, in the sense that, well, actually, we can get some fundamental adaptations just from lifting heavy initially. You know what I mean? And if you can't squat 1.5, 1.6, 1.8 times body weight, there's some easy wins there. Like almost anybody we know, whether you think they're a good strength coach or a bad strength coach, can probably get somebody to squat 1.6, 1.8, maybe even double body weight, with a good run of training. So again, it comes back to having some easy wins. But what I think you can lose sight of there is the value, like we've talked about with some extensive work, or the value you can have in just having that work in all the time, I would say is probably something that I would appreciate a little bit more. So I'm definitely a lot less dogmatic about where your strength levels need to be to do plyometric work. And then in some ways, again, I think it's like anything, depending on the athlete cohort you're working with, when you start to work with Olympic athletes, people who are, have a legitimate chance of going to the Olympic or the Paralympic Games, there's a point at which you have to learn that, like, whether you were working with, these are talented athletes and they've gotten to a certain level without you, and if you were to not work with them, there's a good chance they'd be really good anyway.
Yeah, 100%.
And so I think to some degrees I've probably become more conservative around some of the areas you spoke about already, which is, the overlap of the sport, what we do in the gym, in the plyometric work, and also like the athlete's own bespoke training history and injury history. So I've probably become a little bit more conservative in that domain, trying to understand a little bit more that, okay, here's the training adaptation or the training outcome I'm hoping to achieve, but also being mindful of, like, well, what is that principle of do no harm? What are the potential downsides here? If I get this wrong, what might happen, and how can I mitigate that a little bit? So I've probably gotten a little bit more conservative or more mindful, I would say, around the athlete's own bespoke injury history, what they're getting from the sport, and and the plyometric work, or the general training that we want to do over here, and just trying to bring those three things together a little bit more mindfully, I would say.
So in general, like, you going from more of the heavy hitters to more of the individualized nature, and where the smaller work that fills the gaps in for people who need it well.
I would say probably just more conscientiousness around whether, again, maybe come back to one of those first things we spoke about. What do we need to do versus what do we want to do?
Yes.
I want to do the high output, high reactive strength, measurable plyometrics. I'm interested in them. They're really cool. The athlete loves doing them. But are they what we need to do right now? Yeah. And if they are, then that's fine. But how do we mitigate the risk? And how do we kind of work on establishing that this is a shared plan and this is what we should be doing? And again, I think once you follow the process and you've built some basic strength competencies and you've built some kind of tolerance to plyometric volumes, I don't think these are particularly dangerous activities by any means. And I think injury is relatively rare with them. But I think it's just having that conscientiousness or that mindfulness around bringing those three things together. And then I guess, just if I think about, again, thinking about some of the stuff we've covered already, probably the last piece, maybe what's changed is just maybe understanding that when you do get into the realm of measurement, that reactive strength index or whatever measurement you're using there, it's not necessarily a more is always better quality. If I think we're talking about straight line speed, more is almost always better, right? There's not too many examples. There probably are some where we take a slower speed. And again, I was probably in the mindset of, well, we're going to test this, we're going to test it often, and we want to see it improve longitudinally, consistently over time. I think now, harking back to some of the things we've spoken about already, I'm probably more mindful, again, that trade-off between the relaxed expression of power or force versus, the overly stiff and technically inefficient expression of force that can happen when you do some of these tests. So a little bit more willing to understand that actually we kind of want you in this rough kind of bandwidth based on what we've seen other athletes do, or based on what we know you can do. But whether you're here or here doesn't matter too much to us, as long as you're moving well and you're completing all your training. And in these training exercises, it looks like this technical model we have over here.
Yeah. So, like, we want you in the bandwidth as long as you're skillful there. Like, basically, like, if you jumped up, but it was like, then it wouldn't necessarily be what you're looking for. And it's a really
and again, you might tolerate that in the context of a test. Let's say we only do this once a week or once a month, and it's a 5 jump or a 10 jump protocol. I don't think it really matters too much how they do it. But we're not going to applaud a change from 2.6 to 2.9 reactive strength index if in a lot of your other training it's overly stiff and it's poor positions and there's no pelvic control and it's very plantar flexed at the foot, for example.
Yeah. So actually, I'll have one last little quick question based off of that, because I know we talked about it before. Now you got my wheels going. But like, I know for me, when I was in graduate school, I had to just jump. I was maxing out my 2-leg RSI. Like, I was so excited about that test, new test. But I found I didn't, as I maxed that test out, and I don't know what it would have been a few years earlier, but I didn't jump higher at age 23 doing it, maybe 24, than I did at 21, 22. But what about like a single leg RSI, I guess? But you could measure that maybe just doing plyos. I don't know, like if you had a running 5 left leg bounds and you went further, I mean, in a sense, you're improving that. You know,
I guess all this stuff is becoming more accessible now.
Yeah.
So in our facility, we have a big long track of octo jumps, so you can do repeat jumps and get really accurate distances and contact times, which is nice. But even some of the wearable technology now, like the output device or what the push device used to be, like a lot of those will give you good estimations of contact time in freer activities. Again, coming back to that comment earlier about, I mentioned about the trade-off between overload and specificity. There's probably also that little bit of a trade-off between specificity and maybe what you might call experimental control. So, the freer the activity gets, so let's say you want to know what the contact times are and you want to know what the bounding or hopping or stride length distances are. The freer that activity gets, I think, the less you know about maybe the more variable it's going to be. So I think sometimes we want our cake and we want to eat it. It's like, well, if you want to test, a lot of the time you have to constrain that test in some way. That's why we put the hands on the hips when we do a counter movement jump. That's why we need you to stay on the spot when you do a repeat jump protocol, And so I do think there's definitely some, I think, quick and easy protocols you could have there, bounds for distance, hopping for distance. But I think once you start looking at those distances and the contact times, it just becomes a more open environment, and it's probably not as tightly constrained as it could be. The problem with tightly constraining things is it's less specific.
Yeah.
So again, it's probably telling us something a little bit, maybe giving us a little bit of a proxy for a particular, it's probably giving us a little bit of a proxy for a particular strength quality. So let's say bilateral or unilateral reactive strength. But again, it's further removed from what you actually do in the sport. And as a result, you'll have more of those, you described one earlier, you'll have more of those false negatives.
Yeah.
So for example, people who score poorly on the test, but you watch them on the field and they're just beautiful and you won't change a thing. So you'll always get a little bit more of those false negatives when you tightly constrain a test too, I think.
Yeah.
But again, unilateral jumping or hopping, I guess we call it, unilateral hopping on the spot works really well as a reactive strength test also. But it is a little bit less constrained. Now you've got to think about what the opposite limb is doing.
Yeah,
how much are you
legs and arms.
How much are you allowing the athlete to swing? Obviously, like the pelvic control in a unilateral stance is now going to be more of a factor. So it's a little messier. There's a little bit more variance from rep to rep. But I think it can still be useful as long as you probably account for that variance within your analysis of whether this thing is getting better or not. Like if an athlete's got 15% variance from rep to rep within a single set of the test, and let's say over 3 months they get better by 8%, that's probably not a real change. Like it's within the variance that they're showing in just one set. So I think as long as you can account for that stuff, I think it can still be pretty useful.
Yeah.
And as long as you can accept that you either have a degree of experimental control or you have a high degree of specificity, but you can't really have both, I don't think.
Yeah, there was that sweet spot of athleticism. Like I think I remember it was like Ronaldo, they had him doing like a standing vert test and he was terrible.
Yeah.
And then they gave him a little run up. Of course, he gets better. But I would imagine he would be that exact type that probably isn't a great tester, even if his double leg RSI, and then goes on the field and just like blasts off, like.
Yeah, or just like, counter movement jumping is one of the best examples that we've all worked with these athletes who we know are super fast twitch. They are like explosive, they're reactive. But they just haven't learned to really move from their hips effectively.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And when they jump, it's super shallow at the hip, super shallow at the knee. It's probably still pretty good based on that range of motion, but they've never learned to really, hinge or to sit at the hips to give them longer to generate that force. And you'll get false negatives, I think, even on something as simple as a counter movement jump. Maybe not all the time, but often.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely things to keep in mind. And I think that's where too, yeah, like doing even sport things in the same vicinity and observing those things. And yeah, I think it's always something to keep in mind. So awesome. Well, hey, I know, I think we're both running a little bit. I know I think you said your kids are going to like invade the office soon, and I'm happy we can make this happen again. I'm glad I finally got you down to have a chat. So thank you again so much, Eamonn. It was great talking to you again. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, very welcome. Thanks a lot, Joel.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode. It was great having you here, and I'll see you next week.